Welcome to Lives Beneath History. Britomaris stands with wine on his breath and iron in his hand, a scarred prince marked by gold and long years of war. In the restless centuries before Rome claimed the world, he leads his warriors east into Macedon, where tribes and kingdoms test one another with spear and shield. He has crossed mountains and rivers to stand among the Greeks he once knew only by rumor and trade. This is his story. There was nothing quite like the taste of wine after a fight, Britomaris thought. The whole cupful went down his gullet in a single long swallow, thick and sour and warm from the afternoon sun. It carried the dust of the camp with it, the grit that clung to everything after men had trampled a field into mud and churned earth. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and held the cup out without looking. "More vine, Neil," he said, and a servant hurried to fill it from a clay jar resting in the shade of a wagon. The wine was not from his homeland. It was Greek, taken from a village storehouse that now stood open and smoking behind the lines. He could taste the difference. Lighter, thinner. It did not matter. It did its work the same. As he drank, he remembered the first time he had tasted the stuff, years ago on the long boat trip from Massalia to Syracuse. He had been young then, strong and eager to prove himself among the older warriors of his tribe. They had pressed cup after cup into his hand as the vessel pitched across the open sea. He had not known when to stop. By nightfall, he had been leaning over the rail, emptying his stomach into the dark water, while the older men laughed and clapped him on the back. He could still recall the sharp salt wind in his nose and the way the deck had seemed to tilt under his feet. Back then, he had been foolish. His hair had been thick, his teeth unbroken, all his fingers still on his hands, but he had owned nothing beyond his sword and a share in the tribe's herds. No gold, no name worth repeating. Britomaris had come far since that voyage. 4 gold rings circled his upper arms, tight against muscle, hardened by years of riding and fighting. Another clasped each wrist. A heavy torque lay against his collarbone, warm from his skin. The gold was not decoration alone. Each piece marked a victory, a pledge, a payment. Men noticed such things. They measured a leader by what he wore and by how many warriors stood behind him. When the horns sounded, the bronze helmet on his head was dented in 2 places and polished bright along the ridge. His long iron sword rested in his left hand, while the right held the wine. The mail shirt over his chest dragged at his shoulders. He had seen many a tattoo, many battles. The first had been a small clash with the neighboring tribe upriver, little more than a raid over grazing land. He had felt terror then, the tightness in his belly before the charge. He had hidden it by shouting louder than anyone else. After that had come larger wars, a brutal fight against Carthaginian traders who had thought to punish his people for interfering with their roots. Later, the Brutians in the south, then the Romans pushing outward with their iron discipline. Then the Illyrian raiders, who were as quick with a blade as any Celt. The names blurred. So did the faces. The wine and the blows to the head had dulled many details. He could no longer remember the order of it all. But he remembered the weight of shield against shield, the sound of iron biting bone, the smell of sweat and leather and opened entrails. Those years had carved lines into his face and stripped hair from the crown of his head. They had also given him something solid, a reputation. In this world of swords and gold, a name that caused men to pause before drawing against him was worth more than a chest of coin. Hundreds of warriors followed him now. They had assembled in the spring when the chiefs gathered and counted their strength before marching east. Each leader had ridden forward with his contingent, banners snapping in the wind, boasting of numbers and courage. Britomaris had brought more than most. Only a handful had surpassed him. That mattered. Influence at council fires was measured in spears. The march through the mountains into Macedonia had been long and punishing. Narrow passes forced them into columns. Pack animals stumbled on loose stones. Men slipped and cursed as they hauled wagons up slopes that seemed to climb into the clouds. Supply grew tighter the farther they went. They took what they needed from villages along the way, sometimes trading, often not. It was far from Massalia, though even that place had never felt entirely his. Greeks filled its markets, spoke their fast language, and wrote their signs in marks that looked like scratches from a stylus. He had known Greeks since boyhood. ever since settlers from Massalia had pushed inland along the river and built storehouses near his father's village. Some had come peacefully, offering wine and oil and fine pottery in exchange for hides and grain. Others had pressed harder, claiming land as if it were empty simply because no walls stood upon it. As a boy, he had watched them unload amphorae from boats and had asked them where they came from. Massalia, they had answered, but their fathers had sailed from a place called Athens, far across the sea in Hellas. He had imagined that distant land as a place of white stone and endless ships. Now he stood in Hellas, or close enough. The men they had just fought and killed were Greeks that he knew. They had formed ranks on a low rise beyond the village, shields locked, long spears angled forward. He had seen such formations before. The first time had unsettled him. The forest of spear points had looked impenetrable. Experience had taught him otherwise. The trick was to strike at the flanks, to draw part of the line out of position, to use speed and noise to break their order. A brave man could sometimes slip under the spears from the front, ducking low and rushing into the narrow space between shield and thigh. It was madness for most. He had done it once in his youth and survived. Cutting upward into a Greek's belly and feeling hot blood pour over his hands. He had no desire to repeat it at his age. Today he had not. He had ridden along the line instead, shouting orders, directing groups toward weaker ground, signaling with his sword. When younger warriors surged too far ahead, he had wheeled his horse and driven them back into position with curses and the flat of his blade. He knew the cost of losing cohesion. Youths without scars believed courage alone won battles. They learned quickly that formation and timing mattered more. Better that he guide them from horseback than join the crush at the front. He had shed enough blood in earlier years to understand the value of restraint. A brigantos, a prince among his people, could not avoid danger entirely. His authority depended on visible strength, but neither could he waste himself in every charge. Leadership required survival. When victory seemed certain, he had allowed himself a brief advance, riding close enough that his presence could be seen by friend and foe alike. He had swung his sword in wide arcs, not to strike but to signal. The sun had flashed along the iron. Men had roared in answer. The Greek line had buckled at the flank, where one of his captains pressed hardest. Once a gap opened, the rest had followed quickly. The fight had dissolved into scattered pockets of resistance. Spears were less useful without neighbors to anchor them. The field now lay quiet, except for the groans of wounded men and the distant crackle of burning thatch. Britomaris drained another cup of wine and handed it back. He could feel the weight of the day in his shoulders. A dull ache throbbed behind his eyes, where an old scar lay hidden under thinning hair. He removed his helmet and set it on a crate. Sweat had dried along his brow, leaving salt tracks. A servant brought water, and he poured it over his hands, rubbing away blood that was not his own. He inspected his sword edge carefully. No chips. He ran a whetstone lightly along it anyway. Steady strokes, listening to the scrape. Maintenance was as important as courage. A dull blade could cost a man his life. Around him the camp settled into its after-battle rhythm. Captives were gathered and bound. Plunder was sorted under the watch of appointed men to ensure fair division. Horses were watered. Wounded warriors were carried to tents where healers worked with needle and poultice. Britomaris listened to the sounds without looking directly. He did not need to see everything to know it was proceeding. He had chosen his lieutenants carefully. Each understood his role. The host in Macedonia was large, a coalition of tribes bound by shared purpose and the promise of gain. Such alliances were fragile. Success in battle strengthened them. Failure would unravel them quickly. Word had spread that the Macedonian king himself was near, attempting to rally resistance among the Greek cities. Some leaders in the host spoke of marching deeper, of forcing open the rich plains beyond. Others argued for consolidating gains and extracting tribute before winter. Britomaris weighed these discussions carefully. Supplies would not stretch forever. The further they moved from friendly territory, the harder it became to maintain order. He knew from past campaigns how quickly enthusiasm could turn to hunger and dissent. Still, the opportunity tempted him. To strike down a king was no small thing. It would raise his standing beyond any gold ring. That was why he had resolved to take the Macedonians' head himself, if the chance came. Not out of reckless pride, but calculation. A decisive act at the right moment could secure loyalty for years. He pictured the scene with practical clarity. The king would likely be surrounded by guards, disciplined men with heavier armor than most Greeks. Breaking through them would require coordination. He would need a tight group of trusted warriors, men who would not falter at the sight of ornate crests and polished shields. Speed would matter. Surprise would matter more. If the king fell quickly, panic would ripple outward. Armies built around a single figure often collapsed when that figure died. The trick, he reminded himself, was to do it with one clean blow. No hacking, no fumbling. A swift cut at the neck where helmet met collar. He had executed captives before. He knew the angle required. He preferred not to make a spectacle of it. Excess invited chaos. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the trampled field, Britomaris rose and walked slowly through the camp. Men straightened when he passed. Some lifted cups in salute. He acknowledged them with a nod. He stopped beside a group dividing captured shields. "Keep the best for our front ranks," he said. "The rest can be traded." They obeyed without argument. He paused near the healer's tent and stepped inside briefly. A young warrior lay on a pallet, leg bandaged tightly. The man tried to rise at Britomaris's presence. "Stay," Britomaris said. He looked at the wound. A spear thrust, clean but deep. The healer assured him the bone was intact. Good. A man could fight again with time. Britomaris understood the importance of such visits. Warriors needed to see that their sacrifices were noticed. Outside, he mounted his horse and rode to the edge of the camp, where the land sloped gently toward a line of trees. Beyond them lay the route deeper into Macedonia. He studied the terrain. Open ground favored cavalry. Dense woodland favored ambush. He considered how a Macedonian force might approach. Scouts would need to range farther tomorrow. He would send experienced riders at first light. The air cooled slightly as evening approached. Smoke from cooking fires drifted low. He felt the wine settle in his stomach, a warmth that dulled the sharp edges of memory. He thought again of the boy on the ship to Syracuse, retching over the side while older men laughed. That boy had wanted nothing more than recognition. He had achieved it, though not in the way he had imagined. Recognition came with responsibility. Every decision he made now carried weight for hundreds of men and their families back home. He could not afford careless heroics. Yet he also could not appear cautious to the point of weakness. Balance. That was the true skill he had learned over decades. When darkness finally gathered, he returned to his tent. He removed the gold from his arms and neck and set each piece carefully into a wooden chest. He unbuckled his mail and felt relief as the pressure lifted from his shoulders. Before lying down, he took up his sword once more and checked the edge by touch alone. Satisfied, he placed it within easy reach. Tomorrow would bring new decisions. The Macedonian king would not wait idly. Britomaris lay on his back, listening to the muted sounds of the camp settling into sleep. He did not dwell on glory. He considered routes, numbers, supply lines, and the discipline of his men. If the chance came to strike at the king, he would take it. One clean blow, no mess. Then the host would look to him not just as a successful raider, but as the man who had altered the course of this campaign with his own hand. That was enough. In the Chronicles of Kings, his name may rest in the margins, if it is written at all. Greater rulers command the center of the page, their victories counted in cities and crowns. Yet men like Britomaris carried those pages forward, one march and one hard decision at a time. His gold rings and battered helmet spoke not of legend, but of endurance. He sought no marble statue, only standing among his own and a memory that would outlast the next campaign. History remembers empires. It is built by men such as him. Thank you for listening to Lives Beneath History.